I am an old man, and old men are allowed to be slow about things, so I will tell you the whole of it from the beginning, the way I saw it, standing where I stood with the sun on the back of my neck, and a phone I barely knew how to work held up in two unsteady hands. I had not meant to film anything. I had come to the capital alone that summer, the first summer after I buried my wife of 41 years, because the house had gone quiet in a way I could not sit inside any longer, and because she had always wanted to see the old palace and we had always said next year. There is no next year in the end. There is only the year you are in. So I took the early train, and I put on the better of my 2 jackets even though the day promised heat, and I walked up through the city to Old Mark Palace to stand among the strangers and watch the changing of the guard, the way she would have liked. You should know, before I go on, that I was a soldier once. A long time ago, and not for long, and never anywhere that earned a man medals or stories worth the telling. But the army marks you. It puts something in the spine that never quite comes out, a way of standing, a way of seeing other men stand. 40 years a joiner, hanging doors and laying floors and teaching apprentices not to measure once and cut twice. And still, when I walk into a room, some old corner of me counts the exits and reads the people. I tell you this so you will understand why I noticed the guardsman before anything happened, before there was anything to notice. I noticed him the way one craftsman notices another's joinery across a hall, not the polish of it, but the truth of it underneath. The sovereign's court of Old Mark Palace is a great gravel and marble forecourt behind a tall screen of black iron railings, and at the south gate, in the worst of the noon sun, stood a single guardsman of the lifeguard. I will give him his name now, though I did not learn it until later, Sergeant Daniel Crow. At the time he was only the man in the red tunic, the tall black bearskin, the white gloves, the polished boots, the rifle held just so against his shoulder. There were perhaps 200 of us pressed up against the railings to look at him, and he might have been carved out of the same stone as the gate-post for all the notice he took of any of us. The heat that day was a living thing. By 11, the gravel of the court threw the light back up at you, and the iron of the railings was too hot to keep your hand on, and the tourists fanned themselves with maps and guidebooks and complained in a dozen languages. I am told the ceremonial tunic is heavy wool, and the bearskin alone weighs as much as a sack of plaster, and a man stands inside all of that for 2 hours at a stretch without water, without shade, without so much as shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I had stood my own long stands in my time, on parade grounds in my youth, and I remembered how the body begins to argue with you after the first half hour, how the small of the back sets up its complaint, how the mind goes looking for somewhere to wander. And here was this man, this Sergeant Crow, standing in the forge of that courtyard as if the heat were a rumor he had heard about and chosen not to believe. I watched his face for a long time, the way you watch a flame, expecting nothing and finding yourself unable to look away. It was a young man's face, late 30s perhaps, weathered browner than the indoor sort of man, with a small white scar through one eyebrow that the strap of the bearskin crossed. His eyes were fixed on the middle distance, on nothing, on everything, and they did not move when a child shrieked nearby, did not move when a flock of pigeons came up off the gravel in a clatter, did not move when a woman pressed her face right up to the railing not 3 feet from him and called out to him to smile, just one smile, just for her camera. He gave her nothing. He gave her the same nothing he gave the sun and the stone and the long, slow hours, and there was no rudeness in it, no contempt, only a completeness, as if his whole self had been gathered up and folded away somewhere behind his eyes, and what remained on the surface was discipline and nothing else. That was when the old soldier in me sat up and took notice, because there is a kind of stillness that is only emptiness, a man standing still because there is nothing in him to move, and then there is a different kind of stillness, the stillness of a held breath, of a coiled spring, of a great deal of force kept under perfect control. I had known a few men in my life who had that second kind, and they were never the loud ones, never the ones who told you what they had done. They were the quiet ones who had been somewhere the rest of us had only read about and come back, and decided to be still about it for the rest of their lives. I looked at Sergeant Crow standing in the heat, and something in the set of his shoulders, in the economy of him, in the way even his stillness seemed trained, told me that this was the second kind of man. I did not know it. I felt it. There is a difference, but at my age I have learned to trust the feeling. The changing of the guard was set for noon, and as the hour came on, the crowd thickened and the murmur of it rose, and that is when the others arrived. I heard them before I understood them, a small commotion at the edge of the crowd, a parting, a raised voice used to being obeyed. A man and his people, coming through the press of tourists the way a boat comes through reeds, not pushing exactly but expecting the reeds to bend, and the reeds bending. I will call him the Tycoon because that is what he was and what the newspapers called him afterward, though I learned his name soon enough, Mr. Royce Halden. He was a big man gone soft at the middle, expensively dressed in a pale linen suit that the heat had not been permitted to wrinkle, with a heavy gold watch and a heavier way of carrying himself. I knew the type before he opened his mouth. We all know the type. The man who has spent so many years being the most important person in every room that he has forgotten rooms, can contain other people at all. He had with him a young assistant in a dark suit, sweating freely, holding a tablet and a phone and a bottle of cold water that he kept offering, and that the big man kept ignoring, and a second young man with a real camera with a long lens, and a woman with another phone whose only apparent job was to film whatever Mr. Halden did so that the world might later be made to look at it. They came up to the railing not far from where I stood, and the Tycoon looked through the iron at the guardsman, the way a man looks at a horse he is thinking of buying, or a painting, or a piece of furniture. Up and down, appraising. Already I did not like the look. I have hung doors for men like that, men who look at a thing only to calculate what it can do for them, and I have learned that they look at people the same way. "There he is," the Tycoon said, loud enough for all of us to hear, loud the way men are loud when they want an audience and are pretending they do not. "The famous statue. Get me next to him. This'll go on the deck for the Western boys, they love this old-world nonsense." The young man with the camera moved up to the railing. The woman lifted her phone. And the Tycoon, Mr. Halden, did a thing I had seen tourists do 100 times that morning and would see them do 100 times more, but he did it in a way none of them had. He stepped up close to the railing, right up against it, and he leaned over it into the court, into the guardsman's space, and he snapped his fingers. Twice. The way you might call a waiter, the way you might call a dog. "Hey," he said, "you turn this way, look at the camera." Sergeant Crow did not turn this way. Sergeant Crow did not look at the camera. Sergeant Crow stood exactly as he had stood, eyes on the middle distance, the rifle against his shoulder, the white glove still, and for a moment I had the strange sensation that the snapping fingers had not happened at all, that the man's perfect indifference had reached back through time and unmade them. The crowd around me made a small sound, half a laugh, the kind of sound a crowd makes when it senses, far off, the first faint smell of weather coming. The Tycoon's face did something I will remember for the rest of my days. It registered the refusal, not as a man registers a refusal with anger or amusement, but the way a machine registers an error with a small mechanical confusion, a stutter, as if some basic law of his universe had failed to operate. He snapped his fingers again. "I'm talking to you," he said, and the loudness had gone harder now, a little metal in it. "Turn around. We don't have all day, the meeting's at 1. Now, I want you to understand the thing this man was actually demanding. Because it is easy to lose it under the heat and the noise. He was not asking for a photograph. Anyone can have a photograph. The guardsman stands there precisely so that anyone may have a photograph, and 1,000 had been taken that morning. What the Tycoon was demanding was obedience. He wanted the man behind the railing to move because he had told him to. He wanted to see his word land and take effect on a human being, the way it landed and took effect 100 times a day in his offices and his boardrooms and his life. He wanted the small daily proof, which men like him need the way the rest of us need water, that the world rearranges itself around their wanting. And the guardsman would not give it to him. Not because the guardsman wished to deny him. I do not think the guardsman regarded him at all, any more than the gatepost regarded him. But because the guardsman was not the Tycoon's to command, would never be the Tycoon's to command, stood on the far side of a line the Tycoon had not even seen, because he had never in his life come up against a line he could not cross. I have thought about that a great deal since. I think that is the true beginning of the whole business. The Tycoon had spent his life never once standing in front of something that would not yield, and here, on a hot afternoon, in front of 200 witnesses with phones, was the first such thing he had ever met. A man in a red coat who simply would not bend and could not be made to. The minutes that followed, I will tell slowly because they happened slowly, and because every step of the road that ended where it ended was taken by the Tycoon, one boot in front of the other, with every chance in the world to turn back. He began with money the way his kind always do. He took out a folded note, a large one, and he held it up between two fingers and waggled it at the guardsman through the bars. "Come on," he said, and now there was a performer's edge in it, a showman playing to the crowd he could feel gathering. Everybody's got a price. One little salute, one for the man who's about to buy half this city. A few people laughed, the nervous laugh, and that fed him. He liked the laugh. He held the note higher. No, more. He took out a second note. "There, now we're talking," snapped to its soldier. The guardsman's eyes did not so much as flicker toward the money. I was close enough to see that his gaze did not change its focus by a hair, that the money and the man holding it occupied precisely the same place in his attention as the pigeons and the heat haze and the great indifferent weight of the afternoon. And I will tell you, something in my chest stood up a little straighter to see it. I am not a wealthy man. I have watched money open doors all my life that stayed shut to better men than the ones who walked through them. To see a person to whom that waggled note was simply not a force at all, was nothing, was air, it did something to me. It was like watching a man stand in a storm and not be wet. The Tycoon put his money away. He was not laughing now. His assistant murmured something to him, leaning in, the bottle of water held out again, and I caught a few of the words, "the car," and "we're going to be." And Mr. Haldon, the meeting, and the big man brushed him off with the back of his hand without looking at him, the way you wave off a fly, and the young man's face when he did it told me a great deal about what it was like to work for Mr. Royce Haldon. There was a flinch in it. A practiced flinch. The flinch of a man who has been waved off that way 1,000 times and learned to make himself small around it. "You see this," the Tycoon said, turning to the crowd now, opening his arms, taking us in. He had a big easy voice when he wanted to use it, the voice of a man who has closed a great many deals across a great many tables. "This is what's wrong with the old world. You pay a man to stand in a costume in a courtyard, and he can't even do the one thing, the one simple thing he gets paid to do, which is to give the tourists a little show. Back home, you don't perform, you don't get paid. Simple." He turned back to the railing and rapped his gold ring against the iron, hard, 3 times, the way you'd knock to wake a sleeping dog. "Hey, Tin Man, anybody home?" I felt the crowd shift around me. The mood had changed. There is a moment when a bully gets going in front of a crowd where the crowd has to decide what it is, and ours had begun to decide. The nervous laughs had stopped. People had stopped fanning themselves. A young woman near me had her phone up and pointed, and so did the man beside her, and so, I realized, did I had taken mine out without deciding to. Some instinct of the old soldier telling me that this was the kind of thing a man might be glad afterward to have a record of. The phones came up all along the railing like reeds turning toward a wind. The Tycoon, I think, mistook them. I think he thought they were cameras for his show. He did not understand that the crowd had begun to film him the way you film a fire, not to admire it, but to remember which way it spread. And through all of it, the guardsman did not move. I want to keep saying that because it was the whole of it, and because at the time it seemed almost unbearable, the way the man's stillness sat against the rising heat of the other man's noise. Crow stood with the sun on his bearskin and his eyes on the middle distance, and whatever he felt, and he must have felt something, no man is truly stone. He had taken it all and folded it away behind that face, and what showed was discipline, only discipline, the pure thing itself, held up like a shield against a man who did not even know it was a shield. The bells began to ring noon. You could feel the ceremony coming before you could see it. There is a stir, a tightening, the crowd packing closer to the railings, and far off down the long gravel approach to the court, the sound of boots, many boots in step coming on. The relief was marching up to change the guard, a column of them in their red and black, an officer at the head with a drawn sword, the slow, heavy, beautiful rhythm of it rolling toward us across the gravel. I have seen a great many things in my life, but I will admit my throat tightened to see it, the old thing rising in me, the pride a man feels in good order kept for its own sake. I glanced at the Tycoon to see if even he might be moved by it. He was not moved by it. He saw instead an opportunity. He saw a column of men about to march to a particular spot, and he understood, with the quick low cunning of his kind, that here at last was a way to make the guardsmen move by standing where the guardsmen would have to march and forcing the thing. And so, as the relief came on, Mr. Royce Halden did the stupidest and the most arrogant thing I had seen a grown man do in a very long time. He found the gate in the railing that the marching guard would use, the working gate that a steward had opened for the ceremony, and he stepped through it, onto the court itself, onto crown ground, where no tourist is permitted to set foot, and he planted himself directly in the path of the changing of the guard, and he folded his arms, and he waited with a little smile for the world to bend around him as it always had. A steward called out. The assistant called out half a step behind his master, reaching for his sleeve. "Mr. Halden, sir, you can't." The Tycoon shrugged him off again. The column came on. And the man at the head of it, the officer with the sword, I learned later he was the captain of the guard, a lean, gray-faced man named Ennis. The officer's eyes found the obstacle in his path, and his voice cracked out across the court, a single hard word of command, and the column halted as one man, the boots coming down together in one great crash that I felt in the soles of my own feet. Now there was silence, real silence, the silence of 200 people who have all stopped breathing at once. The relief stood frozen in the heat. The captain stood with his sword, and in the gap between the halted column and the south gate stood the Tycoon, alone on the crown's own gravel, with his arms folded and his smile fixed, looking from the officer to the lone guardsman at the gate and back, waiting to see which of them would be the first to acknowledge that he was the most important thing in the courtyard. The captain spoke to him. I could not hear the words from where I stood, but I could read the shape of them, quiet, clipped, an instruction to leave the court at once. And I could read the Tycoon's answer in the set of his shoulders and the jut of his chin, the answer of a man who has never once been made to do a thing he did not wish to do. He shook his head. He said something back and pointed, first at the captain and then at the guardsman. And then he made a gesture I will not soon forget. He flicked his hand toward Sergeant Crow, a little flick, a shooing motion, the gesture you make to clear something out of your way. "Move him," the gesture said. "Move your toy soldier so I can have my picture by the gate, and let's all stop wasting my time." What he did not understand, what men like him never understand until it is far too late, is that there are places in this world that are not for sale and not for bullying, that belong to something older and harder than money, and that the men who keep those places have made themselves into something he could not buy and could not frighten, precisely so that men like him would have, somewhere on this earth, one wall they could not push over. The captain did not move the guardsmen. The captain gave another order, low, and 2 stewards started forward to remove the Tycoon from the court. And that small advance of 2 unarmed palace stewards in their plain dark coats was the thing that finally cracked the Tycoon's composure, because it was the first time in the whole affair that anyone had presumed to lay the smallest authority across his path. He turned on the stewards, and his voice came up out of him in a roar that I could hear plainly now, every word of it, ringing off the marble. Don't you dare! Don't you touch me! Do you know who I am? I am Royce Halden. I am buying the Eastern Works and the river contracts, and half the men your government answers to are flying in tonight to shake my hand. I will own the ground you are standing on. I will have every one of you turned out by morning." And he wheeled away from the stewards, away from the captain, and he strode the last few yards across the gravel to the south gate, to the one man in all that courtyard who had refused him, who had given him nothing, who stood there still as the stone with his eyes on the middle distance. And the Tycoon put his face up close to Sergeant Crow's face, close enough that I saw the spit on his lip in the sun, and he said the words that turned a foolish afternoon into a criminal one. "You," he said, "you move. You move right now, you painted clown, or I will move you myself." And then he did. He reached out with both hands and he took hold of the guardsman's rifle, the rifle held against the man's shoulder, and he wrenched at it hard to drag it down, to drag the man with it, to break the stillness by force, since he could not break it any other way. I have turned that moment over in my mind 1,000 times since, and I will try to give it to you exactly, because everything that the whole long afternoon had been building toward lived inside the 2 or 3 seconds that followed, and because what the guardsman did in those seconds is the reason I am telling you this story at all. A lesser man, a smaller man, an angrier man, a man with less inside him would have shoved the Tycoon back, would have swung at him, would have given the crowd and the cameras the brawl they could feel coming, the ugly grappling scuffle of 2 men at a railing, and it would have been the guardsman's word against the millionaire's afterward, and we all know whose word wins that kind of fight. That is what the Tycoon was counting on, whether he knew it or not. He was counting on the man being a man like himself, who would meet force with force, anger with anger, and so drag himself down to the Tycoon's own level, where the Tycoon always won. But Sergeant Crow was not a man like himself. Sergeant Crow was the second kind of man, the still kind, the kind who has been somewhere the rest of us have only read about and come back and decided to be quiet. And when the Tycoon's hands closed on his rifle and wrenched, the guardsman moved for the first time in 2 hours, and he moved the way water moves, or the way a door swings on a hinge that a good joiner has hung true, without waste, without anger, without 1 ounce of force more than the thing required. He did not let go of the rifle, and he did not pull against the Tycoon's pull. He turned. He turned his whole body a quarter step and brought his gloved hand down over the Tycoon's 2 hands where they gripped the rifle, and he rolled his shoulder, and somehow, I could not have told you how, it was too fast and too smooth. The rifle was free and back against his shoulder where it belonged, and the Tycoon's wrist was folded over in the guardsman's white glove, bent against itself, and the big man was up on his toes with a high startled sound coming out of him, the gold watch flashing in the sun. Held there immobilized by a grip he could not see the working of and could not break, applied without rage, held without cruelty, a grip that did exactly as much as it needed to do and not one thing more. And then the guardsman spoke. For the first and only time in the whole affair, he spoke, and his voice was so low and so level that I heard it only because the whole court had gone silent to listen. "Sir," he said, "step back." That was all, step back. 2 words and the whole of him behind them, all that folded away force given just the smallest outlet, just enough to carry 2 quiet words across 3 feet of summer air. And the Tycoon, I watched it happen, the Tycoon felt the rest of it, the thing under the words, the vast still strength that those 2 words were the visible tip of, and for one instant the arrogance went out of his face and was replaced by the oldest and most honest expression a human face can wear, which is fear. The fear of a man who has, far too late, understood what he has put his hands on. The guardsman released him. He simply opened the glove and let the wrist go and stepped back himself, the half step back to his post, and resumed his stance, eyes on the middle distance, rifle on his shoulder as though nothing whatever had occurred, as though he had not just, in front of 200 phones, disarmed and controlled and let go of a man twice his weight without raising his voice or showing his teeth. The Tycoon staggered back a pace, cradling his wrist, his face white and then red, and the silence held one more terrible second, and then it broke. It broke into noise, the noise of the captain's voice cracking out orders, of stewards moving, of the relief column stirring, of 200 people all beginning to talk at once. And into the noise came new figures, men in dark uniform coming at a fast walk across the court from a door in the palace wall. Palace police, 4 of them, drawn by the steward's signal or by the simple gravity of the thing. And the Tycoon turned to them with his wrist cradled against his chest and his outrage roaring back into him. And he found his voice, and he used it the only way he knew how. "Arrest him," he shouted, pointing at the guardsman with his good hand. "You saw it, you all saw it. He assaulted me. He laid hands on me. Do you know who I am? I want that man arrested. I want him out of that uniform. Get me my lawyer. I will bury this regiment. I will bury this palace. I will own every." And here is where the afternoon turned for the last time, and turned all the way. And I have never in my life been so glad to be standing where I was standing to see a thing turn. The palace police did not arrest the guardsmen. The palace police, the 4 of them, came on past the guardsman as if he were not there at all, and they did not move quickly, and they did not move with any heat because they had no need of heat. They had 200 witnesses. They had 200 phones. They had the whole of it recorded from 40 angles, the snapping fingers and the waggled money, and the man stepping onto crown ground he had no right to set foot on, and the man taking hold of a soldier's arms with intent to do him harm, on royal land, in front of the world. The Tycoon's own woman with the phone had filmed it. The Tycoon's own man with the long lens had filmed it. The evidence the Tycoon had brought along to record his triumph had recorded, instead, his crime. And as the police came up, there came with them an older man, an officer, walking out from the palace door at his own unhurried pace, a tall, spare, gray-haired man in a uniform heavy with the quiet kind of decoration, the kind a man does not buy. I learned afterward that he was a colonel of the regiment, a man named Aldridge, come out to see what had halted his ceremony. And the colonel walked across the court, past the raging Tycoon as though the Tycoon were a piece of weather, and he came to a stop in front of the south gate, in front of the lone guardsman, and he did a thing that made the whole crowd draw its breath. He stopped and he straightened, and he brought his hand up and he saluted the guardsman. The colonel saluted the guard at the gate. An officer with a chest full of ribbons saluted the man in the red coat that the Tycoon had been calling a tin clown and a painted statue not 2 minutes before, and he held the salute, and he said something to him. I was close, I heard it, though it was meant only for the 2 of them, he said. Good to see you holding a different sort of line, Sergeant. Steady as ever. And Sergeant Crow, his eyes still forward, the smallest possible motion of his head, answered him, Sir. The Tycoon had gone quiet. You could see the new information arriving in his face, the way water arrives in a dry channel, slowly and then all at once. He had taken hold of the wrong man. He had taken hold. It was becoming plain to everyone in that courtyard, including at last himself, of no ordinary fellow in a costume, but of a soldier, a real one, the kind that other soldiers, decorated gray-haired colonels, come out into the sun to salute. And he had done it on crown ground in front of the world, and there was no boardroom on this earth and no lawyer and no folded note and no flying-in handshake that was going to fold this afternoon up and make it disappear. The colonel turned at last to the Tycoon. He looked at him for a long moment, up and down, the same appraising look the Tycoon had given the guardsman 2 hours before, only there was nothing of buying in it, only a cold and complete and unhurried assessment, the look a man gives a thing that has broken and must now be cleared away. And then the colonel spoke, not loudly, but in a voice pitched to carry, the voice of a man giving an order he has no doubt will be obeyed. This man, the colonel said, with the smallest tilt of his head toward the guardsman, stood his post for 2 hours in this heat without moving, while you abused him, while you bribed him, while you trespassed on ground you were warned to leave, and he gave you nothing but his patience. And when you laid hands on him and his weapon, He did precisely what he is trained to do, and not one thing more. He secured you, and he warned you, and he let you go. You would do well, sir, to spend whatever years you have remaining learning to be 1/10 the man you spent this afternoon insulting. He turned to the police. He assaulted a soldier of the lifeguard on Crown ground in front of all these people. You have it on 100 cameras. Take him. I will not soon forget the sound the Tycoon made then. It was not a word. It was the sound of a whole life's worth of certainty going out from under a man at once. The certainty that his name was a key that opened every lock, that his money was a tide that lifted him over every wall, that the world was a soft and yielding thing arranged for his convenience. The palace police took Mr. Royce Halden by his arms, gently, correctly, with no more force than the moment required, and they drew his hands behind his back, and the handcuffs went on with a small bright sound that carried clear across the silent court, and he was led away. The great man, the man who an hour before had told us all that he would own the ground we stood on, marched off across that ground with his pale linen jacket gone shapeless on him, and his gold watch winking in the sun, and his mouth working but no useful word coming out of it. His assistant stood frozen, the water bottle still in his hand. The woman lowered her phone. The man with the long lens did not know where to point it. And Sergeant Crow stood at his post, eyes on the middle distance, rifle on his shoulder, white gloves still, exactly as he had stood for 2 hours, exactly as he would go on standing for the 2 hours that remained of his watch, as though the whole storm had blown through and over and past him and left him precisely where it had found him. The colonel gave one more order, and the captain's voice cracked out, and the relief column came back to life, and resumed its slow, heavy, beautiful march across the gravel, and the bells, which had finished their noon, seemed to ring on a little in the quiet. I lowered my phone. My hands were shaking, and I told myself it was the heat. It was not the heat. I have read since that the Tycoon's evening did not improve. The men he had been so sure were flying in to shake his hand were, it turned out, a good deal less eager to be photographed beside a man whose arrest the whole nation was watching by suppertime, and the Eastern works and the river contracts he had been about to own went, in the end, to quieter men. And there were other consequences besides of the legal kind that I do not fully understand and will not pretend to. It is enough to say that the man who came to that courtyard certain he would own the city went home owning a good deal less than he had arrived with, and that he had handed the loss to himself, with his own 2 hands, in front of the world, by mistaking patience for weakness and discipline for emptiness and a soldier for a statue. But it is not the Tycoon I think about on the long evenings now in the quiet house. It is the guardsman. It is Sergeant Daniel Crow, whose name I had to learn from the newspapers, who stood in the heat and gave a cruel man nothing, and answered an assault with a grip that did exactly what it needed to and let go the moment it was done, and spoke 2 words in the whole of an afternoon, and then went back to standing still. I came to the capital that summer alone, an old man with a quiet house and a wife in the ground, and not much left that I was sure of. I thought I had come to see a costume in a courtyard, a bit of old-world pageantry to tell the neighbors about, the thing my wife and I had always said we would do next year until there were no more years. What I saw instead was a man, a real one. I saw what I had half forgotten in 40 years of hanging doors and growing old, that the strongest thing a man can do, the very strongest, is not to strike, and not to shout, and not to seize, but to stand, to hold inside himself all the force he is capable of, and let out only the 2 quiet words the moment actually requires, to be the one wall in the world that the Mr. Royce Haldens of it cannot push over no matter how hard they lean. I had thought, somewhere along the years, that the world belonged to the loud, and the ruthless, and the ones who buy and bully their way through every gate. That afternoon, in the worst of the summer heat, behind a screen of black iron, one still man in a red coat showed me I had been wrong, and that there are doors money cannot open and men money cannot move, and that the keeping of such men is one of the few truly good things we still trouble to do. I am an old man, and old men are allowed to make too much of small things. But I do not think this was a small thing. I have shown the video to my son, and to the apprentices who are grown men now with apprentices of their own, and I will go on showing it, because I want them to see what I saw, not the rich man led away, though that was a fine sight in its way, but the other thing, the harder thing to catch. The moment the soldier let go of the wrist he could have broken and stepped back and stood still again, asking for nothing, owed everything, the most powerful man in that courtyard by far, and the only one in it who never once raised his voice. And Sergeant Crow stood at his post, eyes on the middle distance, rifle on his shoulder, white gloves still, exactly as he had stood for 2 hours, exactly as he would go on standing for the 2 hours that remained of his watch, as though the whole storm had blown through and over and past him and left him precisely where it had found him. The colonel gave one more order, and the captain's voice cracked out, and the relief column came back to life and resumed its slow, heavy, beautiful march across the gravel, and the bells, which had finished their noon, seemed to ring on a little in the quiet. I lowered my phone. My hands were shaking, and I told myself it was the heat. It was not the heat. I have read since that the Tycoon's evening did not improve. The men he had been so sure were flying in to shake his hand were, it turned out, a good deal less eager to be photographed beside a man whose arrest the whole nation was watching by suppertime, and the Eastern works and the river contracts he had been about to own went, in the end, to quieter men. And there were other consequences besides of the legal kind that I do not fully understand and will not pretend to. It is enough to say that the man who came to that courtyard certain he would own the city went home owning a good deal less than he had arrived with, and that he had handed the loss to himself, with his own 2 hands, in front of the world, by mistaking patience for weakness and discipline for emptiness and a soldier for a statue. But it is not the Tycoon I think about on the long evenings now in the quiet house. It is the guardsman. It is Sergeant Daniel Crow, whose name I had to learn from the newspapers, who stood in the heat and gave a cruel man nothing, and answered an assault with a grip that did exactly what it needed to and let go the moment it was done, and spoke 2 words in the whole of an afternoon, and then went back to standing still. I came to the capital that summer alone, an old man with a quiet house and a wife in the ground, and not much left that I was sure of. I thought I had come to see a costume in a courtyard, a bit of old-world pageantry to tell the neighbors about, the thing my wife and I had always said we would do next year until there were no more years. What I saw instead was a man, a real one. I saw what I had half forgotten in 40 years of hanging doors and growing old, that the strongest thing a man can do, the very strongest, is not to strike, and not to shout, and not to seize, but to stand, to hold inside himself all the force he is capable of, and let out only the 2 quiet words the moment actually requires, to be the one wall in the world that the Mr. Royce Haldens of it cannot push over no matter how hard they lean. I had thought, somewhere along the years, that the world belonged to the loud and the ruthless and the ones who buy and bully their way through every gate. That afternoon, in the worst of the summer heat, behind a screen of black iron, one still man in a red coat showed me I had been wrong, and that there are doors money cannot open and men money cannot move, and that the keeping of such men is one of the few truly good things we still trouble to do. I am an old man, and old men are allowed to make too much of small things, but I do not think this was a small thing. I have shown the video to my son, and to the apprentices who are grown men now with apprentices of their own, and I will go on showing it, because I want them to see what I saw, not the rich man led away, though that was a fine sight in its way, but the other thing, the harder thing to catch. The moment the soldier let go of the wrist he could have broken and stepped back and stood still again, asking for nothing, owed everything, the most powerful man in that courtyard by far, and the only one in it who never once raised his voice.